Good.
This particular Google Hangout, we're going to discuss, backup and disaster recovery plans, and they get cloudy. What do we mean by that? Well, more and more clients are looking for disaster recovery and backup into the cloud. We want to discuss the whys, the wheres, and the whens. My name is Kevin Leahy. I'm the Group General Manager for the Data Center Business Unit here at Dimension Data. And joining me are two colleagues. First is Jane Bradshaw, and Jane joins us as the Group Director in charge of some of our managed services for storage. Extensive experience as both a storage as well as a compliance administrator. And so also joining us is Pierre, joining us all the way from Sydney. A little early in the day for Pierre. And what Pierre leads are activities to develop the backup and disaster recovery capabilities in cloud. So two very different perspectives, both very long histories in the field. And I think the different approaches and what we're seeing clients doing will benefit all of us. So let's get started. If you look back a few years ago, people spent years consolidating their disaster recovery approaches, and they were very proud when they moved from 60% success rates to the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Those days are gone. In fact, the desire to consolidate disaster recovery is actually reversed, and people are now using more and more domain-specific tools. And the reason for that is the increased pressure on recovery times, the increased pressure on, how do they get, 2 hours snapshots instead of daily images, the deduplication compression ratios. Things have changed dramatically. And more importantly, probably, is the nature of disasters have changed dramatically. A few months ago, I was in Manila, and you think about, many people had said a year or 2 years ago, no one would ever put the disaster recovery for a bank into the cloud. You think about tsunamis and things like that they faced. Every one of the banks there was already experimenting with, how do I do this in the cloud? They may have actually started pilots. So things have changed. People have looked at it very different than the way they were before because they need to be able to recover further away. Even a more, for me here in New York, a little closer to home, after Hurricane Sandy, we had one client who had disaster recovery in 3 different locations, all on the East Coast. Well, after Hurricane Sandy, all those locations were down, and they weren't down for an hour, they were down for 3 days. And had they been able to recover into the cloud, they would have been able to recover very quickly because the whole West Coast, the rest of the country was up and running and operational. So very quickly they moved into pilot to say, how do I move, essential services, not everything, and they wanted to get started, but essential services. In particular, they were a university, and they were looking for the capability to get essential student services. Know the students were safe. Know that they were there, how they could contact them. Those very basic sets of services, they were looking to do those kinds of things. And so first I want to turn to Jane and ask a couple of questions. You've been a compliance officer. You've understood the complexities of backup. People invested a long period of time in creating their backup processes. And in many cases, it represents a large portion of their IT estate. What's the opportunity for people to improve the way they're doing it today if they did it in a traditional way? How much time and effort do they need to do? And do you see them changing that as rules and policies change going forward?
Sure, thanks, Kevin. One of the things that a client should look at first, and then this falls off the table all the time, but they really need to start to look at aligning the cost and the value of their data in the life cycle. So not every bit of data that you have should be stored and backed up on a tier 1 level. That's quite costly. You should be looking at actually bringing how fast do I have to have access to this data, how cleanly does it have to be replicated, and where do I need to keep it. So what we're seeing is not a lot of people are paying attention to that and looking at it. It's just an assumption that everything is tier 1 and I have to have access right away to it. You should be looking at what is the value of that data in the life cycle, because there's data that you don't actually ever touch again. It's infrequent, the blocks of data that you're looking at. It may not be the actual data that's there for financial purposes or for, as you mentioned, student record purposes or being able to contact the students. This is data that it's only, you may touch it once a quarter. That's not something that needs to be on your tier 1 level. The other side of that needs to be looked at is the reliability of the backup plan that you have, the manageability, the affordability, which goes with looking at where the data is, and the security around that data. You also have to have these tools in place in order to indicate to the backup administrator, which we have found too, a lot of backups are done by the backup administrator is someone who has 2 other jobs too. Oh, and by the way, you have some time, so we want you to be the backup administrator for this concern also, and that's an issue. Backup is, especially if you're in a regulated industry and globally, not just what we have here in the U.S., but if you're looking at the different regulated industry and big pharmaceuticals based out of, just say in Germany, their data and where it's backed up is a concern to them and how it's backed up. So I think that we'll see a lot more people and a lot more of our clients that need to look at what tools do I have to bring in so I know that the backups actually happened. And I don't have to have 2 people looking at doing the backup, nor do I have to be worried that did it happen, did it not happen, am I going to get audited and not be able to produce the backups that I need, or as you mentioned, in a disaster, being prepared for disasters. I live in an area of the country, of the U.S., that actually one year we had about 5 different natural disasters that happened between hurricanes, blizzards, a flood, and we had a minor earthquake. So there's 4. We were waiting for the 5th, the locust, to attack us. So you need to have this particular plan in place, and it has to be tested. It's not just a backup, yeah, I've got a backup plan, who cares about it? You have to constantly and consistently be testing your backup plans.
As you looked at that, and good news is I think most data centers are locust proof, so I think we're probably good for at least one of those. But when you looked at it, all these things have changed and the technology has changed. To what extent have backup procedures on-premise stayed the same, or have they been able to modify and keep up to date in sort of all these new approaches and exploiting new technology? I had the impression most people, once they got their backup sort of stable, they left it alone, but as a result, frequently I go in and talk to clients. It's somewhat of an aging process, and certainly not taking advantage of the more new technologies like recent snapshots and things like that.
Well, snapshot backups or the replication, that they set the process in place and just assume that it works. That's what I've found working with various clients and going out on site. And when I specifically ask them, well, you've just brought this new tool in, have you looked at what it actually is doing for you? Are you looking at the reports? Do you see that this backup has happened, or are you just assuming it's happened? And they kind of get a blank look on their face and say, well, doesn't the tool just do that? So the tools that are coming in, they are implementing them and they're utilizing them, but they're not looking at what they really do. And my suggestion is always to a client is, let's look at the backup process that you have in place. You've had the same process for 4 years. Are you sure that's the best process that you can possibly have? Well, it's doing my backups. Isn't that good enough? Yeah, it is good enough if you can ensure that those are actually happening. However, let's look at the cost of that now. Let's look and see what data, as I had said, are you aligning your cost to the value of your data in the life cycle of the backup? That's something that we really have to have we sit and talk to the clients about and start to look at what data is being backed up to what medium and where. That's a key point. Most clients just, I'm backing it up, I think I'm okay. So we introduce how these tools that you're bringing in can actually help you reduce the cost of your backup and the manageability of it.
So I guess that, many cases many of us talk about the book consumption economics, and that so much capability sits in the product, but it's untapped. Uh, I have the impression that a lot of the tools that we ship today, rarely do I get the question, can you integrate this into my existing backup? More often than not, I'm hearing the question, can you manage it with the state-of-the-art processes that will actually take advantage of that? To what extent do you see clients really leveraging the capability of what they have? So are they technology limited or process limited?
Because, as I said, a lot of clients, their backup administrators that's a second job. They're also responsible for doing other things, that they don't have the time to actually sit there and understand all the capabilities of a tool that they've brought in. They just don't have the time to do that. It's, okay, I've learned it, I know how to do the backups, I'm all set. And instead of looking at some of the other reports that these tools are bringing, that are generating for them, and the reports will tell them exactly what type of data is going where, and with a lot of the tools that are out there right now will actually make a recommendation on after a month of doing backups as to if the data should be moved to another tier, or should it be pushed out into this particular medium in order to be backed up. So what I'm seeing is they're not taking advantage of all the tools that are out there, and it's primarily because they don't have the time to understand the full capabilities of what they have.
So it's enablement and process. So that leads us, Pierre, to one of those tiers I hear is cloud, and I would say of all the cloud customers I call on, 3 out of 5 say I really want to back up to the cloud. Now it varies whether it's the primary copy or the secondary copy or the tertiary copy. That customer on the East Coast said, I'm still going to have my standard backup disaster recovery, but in the event of a bigger disaster than my plans encompass, I want a third option. But also we see frequently people saying, boy, a large portion of my estate is backup. Can I just save this if I move it to the cloud? What are you seeing from clients in terms of their requirements for backup? And if you could address both the backup for the cloud components that they're using as cloud processing, as well as for the resources that they have on premise that are not really associated with the cloud, but they see an opportunity for savings or process improvement as a result.
Sure. And I think looking at those different aspects in that way is probably a good start, because the cloud today is still it's still a bit of the Wild West, and what I mean by that is you've got in the Wild West you had the cowboys and you had the wranglers and you had but you also had people building railroads and people putting infrastructure down and expanding their presence. And we see the same in the cloud. We see some folks that are saying, I understand what the cloud is and what it isn't, and I think the consumption aspect of the cloud is one of its hottest topics, one of the best features out of that. So I understand how I can burst into the cloud, I understand how I can expand into the cloud, and I also understand its limitation or what I need to watch out for. And you have other folks that think that because it's in the cloud, somebody else is worrying about it. It's covered by somebody else. And I think that's where some of the danger is. As an example, and I'll give you a few examples that are from conversations with clients that have occurred recently or in the last few months or year anyway. You would never think about deploying an application in your data center, let's say that relied on Active Directory, without backing up Active Directory. It sort of sounds so simple, right? We need to be able to back up Active Directory. And what that means when you look into what does it actually mean, well, as well as big, huge disasters, I need to control or I need to be aware of what happens if a user deletes an OU or a group, or for mistakes, basically. How I can recover that without having to rebuild the whole system. So then you move into that same, let's call them a smart administrator, and now they decide they're going to deploy their application in the cloud, and they put Active Directory in the cloud. that they somehow think that just having a file backup is fine. And you know, when you go down into the details of, okay, what happens if you lose an OU? What happens if someone deletes a group? How are you going to be able to recover that? Their answer is almost baffling. It's like, well, isn't it backed up? Yes, it's backed up, but just like you have to think about how you back something up in your data center, you have to think about how you back something up in the cloud. And you know, Jane talked about the value of data, which I think is very important. You know, we in the cloud sort of era, or the cloud area, whichever way you want to look at it, we see more of the sort of the workload-led thinking. So people are typically, you know, there are some of our customers that have decided to shift their whole data center into the cloud. They tend to be, you know, the more on the edge of technology customers. Probably the majority of them are actually shifting specific workloads to the cloud. Obviously, there's dev test, there's all the normal uses of cloud that are occurring, but from a production point of view, it's often about shifting a particular workload into the cloud. And it's important when you have a workload in the cloud to understand what's my protection mechanism for that workload, what's my DR mechanism for that workload, what's my backup mechanism for that workload, and what's my retention of the data that's important in that workload. And from my point of view, it's not about technology. It's not about saying, you know, product A will do it or product B will do it. It's about really designing it, the same as you design it when you put it in your own data center. So it's about looking at it and going, you know, the key things here, if I've got an Active Directory, for example, I'm going to do AD replication between two different sites in the cloud. If I've got a SQL server, I might use SQL replication. If I've got a bunch of web servers up and running on site A, then because they're not changing much and they're just, you know, serving up my application code, I might use my DevOps tools in order to make sure I have another environment inside B that I can switch to in case of a DR. Notice I haven't talked in any of these about backup, so to speak, but they're all about, you know, data retention. They're all about DR. And then it goes into, okay, what do I need to back up? Do I need to back up my web servers that I just, you know, I've got my DevOps tool and I've backed up, you know, my source code, I've backed up my scripts and I've backed up my data that way. I probably don't need to go in and back up those generic servers, but obviously I might pay more attention to my Active Directory and I might pay more attention to my SQL server. That's sort of what's happening when you're deploying in the cloud. Now, when you're on-premise and you're saying, okay, I want a copy in the cloud, I see, you know, two, I guess, you know, broad segments there. One segment is that wants to use the cloud as simply a secondary data location. So what they want to do is, just like they might have, you know, they have their local backup, they have their primary, they just want one offsite, and they see cloud and specifically usually cloud storage as a, you know what, I'll just put my second copy in the cloud. I'm not going to use it all that time. I have, you know, I accept maybe a slower RTO. I know I'm going to have to pull it down from the cloud if I lose my primary, but that's fine because I'm not expecting to do that often. That's one way, I guess, of looking at it. And we have other customers that are looking at it, say, okay, if I put my second copy in the cloud, the real driver behind this isn't to say, if I lose my primary copy, I want to be able to bring it down and recover it locally. But if I lose my entire site, I want to be able to bring up my site in the cloud. I want to be able to effectively use cloud-based DR, or you know, the ability to launch at least some of my services in the cloud in case of a disaster. And Kevin, this is where, to me, it goes back to, again, that, you know, Jane talked about the value of data, which data is important to you, and I just tuned that slightly to talk about the value of the application. So if you're talking about recovering an app in the cloud, you've really got to, you know, there is no one size fits all. You know, the benefits of having that ability to recover in the cloud obviously is typically around cost, the fact that you don't have to have that infrastructure running 100% of the time. You typically just need the storage, and, you know, you're not paying for CPU and memory, etc., until you use it. But you might want to tier your apps. You might want to look at your top tier apps and say, you know what, I'm going to reserve those. I'm going to have them running all the time because I want to make sure I have that capacity when I need it. You might look at other apps and say, I'm not going to worry about having a 1 hour RPO or an asynchronous almost instantaneous sort of DR. I'm happy with a 1 day RPO or a 4 day RPO, even. So you've got to really get back to basics and say, what do I want to do? Why is this important? Why is this application important? Not now. Yeah, of course, everything we do is important. But if the A380 error, as people say, happens, what do I need this application for? Is that going to be my primary focus, or do I just go into one area?
Now, this is a scary world between the Wild West and the locusts. I mean, I think we could find this dangerous. But cloud self-service. So if cloud self-service, you sounded pretty much like a data center guy. I got to tell you, how many business users, application users know to back it up? I mean, are we trusting the wrong people to know? And how does the business know that they're doing the right things and that the right information is being backed up? And I'll use an example. I was working with a higher education organization in Europe, and they had all this very expensive research, and they knew that the data sat underneath the researcher's desk, and it was completely unprotected and never backed up. So that make it even more complicated, but do it in the cloud. How do you protect against that?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think if you look at the cloud being the Wild West, if you're going to go mining, let's not say you're going stealing horses or anything bad like that, but if you want to go mining, there's two options you've got, right? You can jump on your horse and say, I'm going to head off to where someone told me there's a bit of gold, and once I get there, I'm going to dig it up, right? That's a good approach, Another approach might mean, I might actually take a shovel with me, because if I get there, I want that shovel. And the third approach might be, there's other people that have done this before, and I want to see how they're doing it. And I notice that they've got the cart, and they've got not just a shovel, but they've got a place to store the gold, and they've got maybe some, protection in case they find a lot of gold, and they've got, all those mechanisms. So if we look at the cloud, and if we look at workloads in the cloud, you do have people that are, because it's so self-service, because it's so consumption, departments, let's not talk about specific people, but in an organization you have maybe one department that starts to use the cloud, maybe goes in, signs up, puts a credit card over the counter, so to speak, or over the web, and starts to consume servers, to play, to investigate, to do dev tests. Then what occurs typically is that's bypassing IT. That's not going through the governance process. No one's looking at that. No one's looking at saying, do we have an appropriate backup? What is our protection? I think more and more this was probably dying out. This is probably more about maybe 1 year or 2 years ago. What we're seeing is a lot of our customers are leveraging our systems and leveraging APIs. Let's not talk about ours. Leveraging APIs, and most systems out there that allow you to do backup in the cloud have some kind of automated provisioning, have some kind of way you can say, when you give anyone in my company a server, make sure that server has the appropriate protection, and as a minimum, make sure that the server and the files are backed up. And then having some kind of governance to come back and look at it and say, should I protect more than that? So this is where we can leverage the automated provisioning tools. We can leverage the fact that most of these web-based systems have APIs, have ways you could drive it. What we want to do is end up with the IT organization, helping their organization get to the cloud, without sort of making too much of a fuss about it, without going in and saying, no, you have to come through us, no, you have to order it that way, no, you have to do it this way. By making it easy for them to say, hey, we've created some nice templates for you. If you want to leverage the cloud, here's 20 templates that you might want to look at. And behind the templates would be the fact that backup is already provision on those templates, so that when you have them up and running, you sort of got a bit of coverage that way. The other part is there's one part is, I guess, encouraging users to do the right thing by making it easy for them to do the right thing. The other part is to be able to then, easily tell what is being backed up and what isn't. So this is about really exposing, what is the status of my system, so that if you have that, the analogy of the server under the desk, if you have that one server in the cloud that everyone's using to put all their files in, but that server is not backed up, then just, we need to make it more obvious and make it very clear that, hey, that server is not as protected as perhaps it should be. So someone should have a look at it.
So that implies a couple of things I think I heard, right? One is APIs and policies, and so APIs are a method to enforce the policy to make sure you actually do the right thing, and the other is visibility into the estate and seeing what is actually protected and having the ability to actually report and see it. So Jane, I would think as we look at large enterprises whose future data centers is inevitably going to be comprised some percentage cloud, some percentage on-premise, I would think that visibility into this is a challenge for many people's traditional methods. How do you see people approaching, looking at the entire scope of data and looking at it? Are they changing? Are they building dashboards? Or are they asking us for help? What do you see happening?
They're actually asking us for a lot of help and asking for help in building out of the dashboards, because human error is the biggest issue that we run into in a data center. Human error in not proper formatting of the backup, or inadvertently introducing a software bug, not being able to understand if an entire snapshot has been restored. So the dashboard piece is key. They need to have the single pane of glass that they can look in and have access to all of their storage reports, what has been backed up, whether it's through the cloud or if it's an on-prem system. But more and more what we have been seeing is sort of this hybrid that's been out there, and we see that happening more frequently. It started out in, believe it or not, in smaller clients, and has really moved into the larger clients where they are doing a combination of on-prem and cloud, and on-site to cloud backup. And it's been in management of their storage. And because of the single pane of glass and the accessibility of having the dashboards on their mobile devices, that's something that they need to see that to be able to have the alerts right away. So yeah, Kevin, I see that going on all the time. And being asked to help in things like that is in having a client look at us and being, I don't know where to go now. Help me straighten this out. And having those questions of, I'm not sure if this is really happening. I don't know where my storage, the best use of my storage is. How do I move to get to a point where I can get the reports live and I can see what's going on? That's one of the biggest issues that we see our clients facing. They can't see what's happening within their network, in their storage network right now. And I think what Pierre was saying about the cloud itself and having the dashboards associated, that's key.
So bringing it all together is obviously going to be important for enterprises. It seems to me, though, there's a lot of things that, if you're automated, the great news is you can make changes, you can enforce things. And one simple example I've seen is just simply going in and helping clients with their on-premise backup is by going in and recognizing that you're probably retaining backup copies far longer than you can ever restore from them. Because in the new world, virtualization, moving partitions, images coming and going, cloud coming and going, being able to restore from that data you have, if you're far down the road, a few months down the road, probably you can. Now you have to keep the primary copy, of course, for compliance purposes, but we've seen that simply by changing retention records on legacy copies, cutting the amount of storage required on-premise down in half in many cases. Not to mention the destruction policies that you would like to have after you're no longer required to retain it, get rid of it. so it doesn't come up in discovery later when you didn't actually need to have it retained anymore. All part of the things that we talked about in information lifecycle management, a decade ago, but you really weren't able to do because you didn't have the tools and you didn't have the processes. So the good news is there's hope available, and the even better news is if you can, work with someone who understands the industry best practices, and even more importantly, the best practices within that particular domain or vertical you're in, whether it's healthcare or finance or others, you can quickly move to state of the art. I think we've seen on our cloud, Pierre, I think the number is something like 99.8% success rates. So restores are less the issue in terms of testing and validating. It's more ensuring that it's up and running so that when you run the backup, it will be successful. And so you can do more preparatory things. Maybe you could just spend a second or two on how that actually assists clients, so knowing in advance you're going to be successful.
Yeah, I think you're right. So one of the big advantages of doing something in the cloud is often that the tools are best practice. The ability to the fact that you've got the network under control, or your cloud providers usually monitoring the network, monitoring the capacity, monitoring the storage. What that allows you to do is really jump into very high success rates, as you mentioned, in backing up and in restoring your data. So you move away from the ability of saying, I have to be a backup expert, and what I think we want from the client still is to understand their data. We want them to understand what they want to keep, how long they want to keep it for, and make that choice. And be able to make that choice differently, not do it on a data storage point of view, not say, what do I want to do with that spindle over there, or with that SAN over there, but more being able to do it by workload, being able to say, I'm going to keep my, why would you keep 7 years of Active Directory backups, as an example? You wouldn't, right? You would, what's the chances of you being able to recover, from 7 years ago, your Active Directory, and say, yep, I can get that back, no. But maybe your database, I want to keep for that long. But do you want to keep your logs for that long? No. So you can imagine the amount of savings that you can have by being able to just simply make those very simple decisions without having to actually worry about, how do I have to back up my database versus my AD versus my files, and do I have to talk to the backup guys, and what do they have to do? So there's actually considerable savings into talking to people that, the sheriffs of the Wild West, so to speak, right? The guys that understand backup. And to me, my recommendation is, if you're pure cloud, if you all you want to do is stuff in the cloud, then talk to a cloud sheriff. If you have some stuff on premise and you have some stuff in the cloud, then you sort of need to talk to, I'm not sure what the equivalent of the sheriff is, maybe the ranger or the marshal that understands, that can cross that boundary, the marshal, there you go, and say, you know what, I can go on premise, or I can go into the cloud, and I can go wherever I want and help you with that. And of course, if you don't have any interest in the cloud at all, then you're probably in the wrong hangout, but also maybe talk to somebody that doesn't know anything about the cloud. That's fine, so just get the appropriate advice. Get the people that have done this before, and get the people that have that experience is my key recommendation.
That's great. I think the reality is every client has an interest in cloud. They just don't know how much is going to get there over time, and time will tell. But on that journey, they can't sacrifice their compliance rules. And with data growing as fast as it is, they also can't keep up with what they've got on premise. So they need to really take advantage of best practices in both, and they need visibility to the total estate so they can ensure their business is in compliance. So with that, I'm going to bring this to a close. We could continue going a long time. I guess how well we did will be judged by how long people retain a copy of this Hangout. Any questions, though, please hashtag DD Hangouts, and we will respond to those, and hopefully we prompted you to have some thinking about, how do you modify it, how do you get the advantage of savings both on-premise and in the cloud, and really, how do you get the most important protection of your data and your business in the event of an outage or a disaster? So with that, I thank Jane and Pierre for participating, and thank all of you for joining.